exclusively on Secular Media Network. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I am your host, Callie Wright, and thanks for joining us once again. So, normally, when we do episodes, we pick a single topic and kind of just do an extended discussion on that topic, but today's going to be a little bit of a potpourri sort of episode. We're going to have a talk with filmmaker Chris Johnson about his movie A Better Life, which is an awesome movie, and we're going to talk about kind of what it's about and why it's important for atheists to talk about joy and meaning and not just the intellectual side of things. I'm also going to have the first talk that I've ever given on atheism at an LGBT event. An organization called Glisten in Cincinnati does a youth summit every year, and I was invited to speak. They normally have churches there talking about inclusive faith communities and stuff like that. So a member of the planning committee reached out to me and said, "Hey, it might be a good idea to have sort of an atheist perspective there as well." So I gave my first ever talk in that vein. So I'll have the audio of that talk. But first, we have my friend Adam Collins, who is putting together a really unique sort of atheist convention. So something that's often criticized in the atheist movement is that the conventions and all the events surrounding it are super expensive and not really accessible for people who don't have disposable income, people who don't want to leave their kids behind, they can't afford a sitter, or, there's not a place for them, for their kids at these conventions. And these conventions are super expensive to put on. They're super expensive to attend. Because of that, and no one really makes any money, contrary to what people may believe. A lot of times, honorariums for the speakers are paid by sponsors, not by the convention, because these things are incredibly difficult, incredibly time-consuming, and really expensive to put on. So it's prohibitive for many people to get to these things, and therefore a lot of people are left out, and a lot of people are left feeling like their issues, the things that they care about, the things that they want to hear about, and the things that they talk about go unaddressed in the atheist community. So, a good friend of mine, Adam Collins, has come up with a solution to this, and Adam's here to talk about it with us today. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, Callie. Thanks for having me.
So, tell me what's going on. We got the Atheist of Facebook convention, which I'm going to be speaking as a part of. I'm really, really excited. So, talk to me a little bit about the event and what's going on.
Well, it's going on November 7th. It's all online, and it's all free to attend. It's basically like a grassroots kind of convention. Not a whole lot of big names, trying to get like the lesser-known people who aren't really well-known in the community, get their message out there and have them get better known.
That's awesome. So what initially inspired this? Was there something that, did it just kind of click in your head, or like what happened that gave you the idea?
Well, what happened was kind of a weird story. I've been involved in the community for about 5 years now, and been trying to break out in some way to get like speaking spots somehow. So after ApostaCon, I was all super inspired like I get when I leave conventions, and decided I'm going to go big and get a spot at the Reason Rally. But I didn't know how to go about doing that, so I just thought I'm going to start a petition, put it on Facebook, and see if I can get enough signatures to get me a spot. And it was only up for a couple hours on Facebook, and I already had like 60 signatures at the time, so pretty excited about it. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Matt freaking Dillahunty sent me a private message. He said, very politely, that petitions literally never work, and I was wasting my time and just putting pressure on the organizers, and it just wasn't going to do any good to do that. So I got a second opinion from another prominent atheist friend, and he totally agreed with Matt. So I took down a petition and asked them what they suggested I do to try to put my name out there, and they just said, start small, try to find local conventions or something that you can speak at, or maybe start your own. And since I'm on the road all the time, since I'm a truck driver, it's hard for me to really plan anything. My schedule's so sporadic, I never know when I'm going to be around. So it just popped in my head. I'm going to start something online because that's something I can do from the truck. And since I want to put my name out there, since I'm kind of unknown, why not get more people's name out there that are unknown? And I have a lot of atheist Facebook friends who are awesome and I think are totally deserving of recognition. So I found as many of those as I could and booked about 15 people, and here we are.
That's freaking cool. I'm a big fan of this entire concept, and I'm really, really excited to be a part of it. You're going to be talking at this convention. What's the subject of your talk going to be?
My talk is going to be something about, like, one of the things that I do regularly on Facebook. Like, I'll just feel generous randomly and just put out a post that I'm going to buy somebody a pizza and have it delivered to their house, or mail them $20 just to see what they do with it, just like a random act of kindness. So my talk's going to be about love and encouraging people to just participate in more random acts of kindness to try to make the world a better place, and why that's important in the atheist community. Christians don't get to have the whole charity concept and all that. We can do it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's awesome. Well, so talk to me a little bit more about that. I mean, we may be preaching to the choir a little bit here, talking about this on this podcast, but I mean, talk to me about why that's important to you.
Well, atheists kind of get a bad rap in America. Well, the world, really. We're getting better at being accepted and all this, but a lot of people just think that it's the stupidest thing, like we're evil just because we don't believe in a God. I don't understand it, but that's how it is, and I don't know, if we get better known as being charitable people who love and accept and tolerate everyone, and I don't know, and we got to do more than just saying it, just showing it, going out and, I don't know, participating in charities, fundraisers, helping people out when we can, donating time to worthwhile organizations, just anything that you can do within your means to help. It reflects positively on the community.
Very cool. So how can people access this? What's the format going to be like?
Well, it's going to be on YouTube. We have our own YouTube channel. It'll be under Atheists of Facebook. And if you look up Atheists of Facebook right now on YouTube, you'll see our commercial that we made for it. It actually turned out really well. I got to thank my friend Salim Williams for putting that whole thing together. He'll be speaking there too. It'll be starting 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the YouTube channel. It'll be pre-recorded talks from each speaker. Each speaker is getting a half hour, and their video can be anywhere between 10 minutes and a half hour. And the rest of the time they can use for Q&A or to do a Google Hangout or anything else that they want to keep the conversation going with their particular audience that wants to keep talking about it.
I love that idea. So is there going to be any sort of, so the videos are going to be pre-recorded. That makes sense, because live streaming is really hard when you're coordinating with people in different parts of the country and different time zones and all that kind of stuff. Will there be any sort of ability to interact with each other live, like a chat room or anything like that?
Possibly. We're still looking into that. We're actually going to start doing this regularly, because I never expected it to take off like it has, but it has absolutely exploded in popularity, and I got people wanting to participate and volunteer, people who are wanting to make a website that's going to have a chat room embedded into it so that we can do better in the future. This first one's going to be awesome, but it's not going to be as good as it will be in the future. But as far as the chat room, I'm not sure yet. The Q&A might take place like in the comment section of each video, or Google Hangouts, or I'm open to suggestions if anybody's got some.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, so how can people get a hold of you if they have, questions, comments, suggestions, or anything like that? Or if anybody listening wants to help volunteer to, help make this thing happen, how can people get a hold of you?
Sure. They can friend me on Facebook, Adam Collins. I'm on Callie's friends list, and private message me. Or there's an event page, Atheists of Facebook Online Convention. They can go there. Or we have an email, atheistoffacebook@gmail.com. And if anybody wants to participate in future conventions, we're totally taking open casting calls for literally anybody. Just make a short introductory video, send it to us through email or on our YouTube page, and we're considering anybody. This is about the lesser known people. So even if nobody knows who you are, you're totally qualified to speak at this event just as much as Richard Dawkins or anybody else would be.
That's the beauty of the internet, right? It makes things so much more egalitarian, I think, and brings those barriers down. The gatekeepers who may only want the big names, but here it's just if you've got something interesting to say, then we're going to give you a platform to say it, and it's a novel concept. I think it's awesome. Because there's lots of conversation going on. As I said in the intro, there's lots of conversation going on in the community now about how, most of the people who end up at these conventions are, at the very least, middle class to upper middle class folks. We can afford to take a couple of days off work. We can afford to spend, 70, 80, 90 bucks a night for a hotel room and 150 or 200 bucks for a conference ticket, and, all the food and all that sort of stuff that goes along with it. So these things are prohibitively expensive for a lot of people, and a lot of people who would love to participate in the wider community just don't get the chance. And this isn't an indictment of the people who put those conferences together. They're extremely hardworking people, and none of them make money doing it. It's just that those things are so expensive to put on. If they made, the conference ticket $20, they would end up coming tens of thousands of dollars out of their own pockets. So it's a really tough problem with these conventions, because it's not like anyone's being greedy and trying to gouge people for the ticket prices or anything like that. It's just a really tough problem, and I think this is an amazing solution to that, to bring more folks to the table and get more perspective and ideas out there. And I'm really, really excited to be a part of this thing. So thanks for coming on the show to talk about it, and I look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Looking forward to seeing you too. And also, not to discourage anybody who is a bigger name, we're totally bringing those people in too, but it's more focused on the people who are mostly unknown. We'll have one or two bigger names for each event, just to give it some star power to attract a bigger audience. But that bigger audience is mostly for the people who aren't very well known.
Well, sure. I think that makes sense because, you brought up Matt Dillahunter earlier, and he's a great speaker, and he's got a lot of good things to say, and there are a lot of people who might not otherwise get to see a Matt Dillahunty talk, live at a convention or anything like that. So I think it still makes sense to have those bigger names involved too, just, not make it an exclusive party for those folks, and make sure that, that anyone with something interesting to say is allowed to participate too. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and Matt, actually, he wants to do a talk for this, but unfortunately, when I scheduled it, I didn't realize that there's another atheist convention, Free Flow, going on in Florida on the same day. So he's going to be there, but yeah, he'll definitely be on a future one for sure.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for joining me, and we'll talk soon.
All right, thank you, Kelly.
We'll be back with a conversation with filmmaker Chris Johnson after this.
I, Olga Kay.
I, Michael Buckley.
I, Kat Graham.
I, Timothy De La Ghetto.
I, Chris Cluey.
I, Issa Rae.
I, Lucas Cruikshank.
I, Hannah Hart. I, Shira Lazar.
I, Brendan Iambadejo.
I, Chester C.
I, Davey Wavy.
I, Margaret Cho.
I, Philip DeFranco.
I, Scott Hoying.
And I, Mitch Grassi.
Pledge to.
Pledge to.
Pledge to.
pledge to let my friends know that they can talk to me.
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 Be respectful and supportive of everyone.
Everyone.
Regardless of sexual orientation
Or gender identity.
To listen.
Listen with an open mind.
And without judgment.
Without judgment.
Without judgment.
Take what people say
Take what people say
Seriously.
Seriously.
Take what people say seriously.
Check in with friends.
With friends.
Check in with friends who may need to talk.
Who may need to talk.
Help a friend call the Trevor Lifeline.
Help a friend call the Trevor Lifeline.
Help a friend call the Trevor Lifeline if they are in crisis.
866.
488.
7386.
Tell a person I trust.
I trust.
Tell a person I trust.
If I think someone is considering suicide.
If I think someone is considering suicide. To call the Trevor Lifeline.
Call the Trevor Lifeline.
Call the Trevor Lifeline.
Whenever I need support.
Whenever I need support.
Whenever I need support.
488.
7386.
Before we jump back into the show, it's time to thank our patrons. Thank you so much for believing in us enough to contribute to us financially and for being a part of this movement. Patrons of the Gaytheist Manifesto have access to all sorts of cool stuff, like a big shout out on the show, premium content, including an audio journal I've decided to keep documenting the more personal stuff I don't dive into on the show, and an exclusive patrons only hangout once a month. If you're so inclined, head over to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to become a part of this movement and support the show. Thank you. Welcome back to the Gaytheist Manifesto. So, a conversation that I think maybe doesn't happen quite enough in the atheist community, maybe it does and I just haven't seen it, is the conversation surrounding meaning and joy and emotional fulfillment and those kinds of things. I think those things are super important just as basic human needs. And there's an independent filmmaker named Chris Johnson who made a book and a movie about these subjects, about finding meaning and joy and beauty in life without a God. And Chris brought his movie screening through Cincinnati, and I was able to meet up with him and talk to him a little bit about the movie and why he thinks this stuff's important. Chris Johnson, welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Thanks for having me.
So the movie is called A Better Life. So why don't you just kind of tell me about the movie?
The movie is a documentary featuring interviews from atheists from around the world, talking about issues of joy and meaning and purpose in a life without God.
And why do you think that's important?
So for so long, much of the conversation about atheism has just been about what we don't believe in, and I felt like one piece that was missing was talking about what we do believe in. How does the world look as an atheist? How do you get your morality? How do you find joy and meaning if this is the only life you have? And I think these are really important questions to talk about as an atheist community.
And so what did you find? What did people say?
Well, I mean, it does change the way you think about the world. I mean, if there is no God pulling the strings, right, it does mean that it is up to us to change the world for the better. So in terms of helping people less fortunate, in terms of making the world a better place, in terms of making your life better and the lives of those around you better, it's up to us. And that's a challenge, but it's also empowering as well.
So why you and why the concept? Like was there any specific thing that that kind of was the impetus for you doing this project in particular?
Well, the idea came when I was on a road trip with my brother through the Southwest, and we stopped in White Sands National Monument in New Mexico, which is one of the most gorgeous places I've ever been. And we were listening to a lot of podcasts about atheism and religion on our trip, and being in that beautiful place and seeing just the astounding natural beauty, and then also listening to these ideas about religion and atheism, got me thinking about, okay, I'm an atheist. How do I see the world? I mean, I'm having such an amazing time in this space. What do religious people see here? What do other atheists see here? And also, much of the conversation, like I said, was about what we didn't believe in, was combating the religious ideologies we disagree with, which I agree is a useful thing to do. We definitely need to push back against these harmful religious ideologies. But at the same time, we also need to address the same questions that religion often gives people answers to. Sometimes answers that aren't true, but it gives them answers nonetheless. And if we don't provide those answers, people are going to be more likely to gravitate towards a religion.
So how long did the project take from start to finish?
It's been about 4 years now since I started the first Kickstarter to do the book, and then all the interviews I did for the book I filmed, which then became the film version, which I'm now touring around the world, showing at different venues.
Okay, so talk about the book for a minute, because the project actually started with the book, right?
Yes, it started as a book. Basically, my brother said to me, you should do a coffee table photography book as a freelance photographer. I was taking all these photos when we were in White Sands, and I said, well, there's so many photography books out there and so many photographers. Nobody knows who I am. Nobody cares. And he said, well, you just have to think of a way to make it different. And being in that space really made me think about, what if somebody made a photography book of happy, smiling, friendly atheists? Because, again, so much of it was like, we don't like religion, we hate this, we hate that. Not just in terms of what we put out, but in terms of people's perception of us as well. So I really want to show positive things. I want to show smiling, happy people. It's been about 4 years since I had the idea, and then ever since then, I finished the book. So the book is a coffee table photography book of these photographs and short essays and transcripts from the interviews. And then the film is based on the interviews that I did, which I filmed all of those. It took about 9 months of editing to put that together.
Jeez. Ugh. I balk at 2 hours of editing for a podcast. So obviously, you made this movie and you made this book talking about, what these things mean for everyone else. What do these things mean for you?
That's a really good question. For a while, it was merely abstract. And I think for many of us, those conversations tend to be. You think of, this is the only life you have, need to make the most out of your life. And we just kind of pay lip service to that most of the time.
Yeah.
Because we have taxes to pay and places to go. And,
right.
And so I was doing that too. And I actually remember a moment of, I was sitting on an airplane and it hit me because I was having these conversations every single day, talking to people. And I thought, oh my gosh, how does this affect me in my life? And it really does make me more appreciative of the good times in my life and really taking a moment to relish and think about and dwell on those happy moments in my life. Because as Julia Sweeney says in the film, that's all you have at the end of the day are those moments. And so you can you can just sit and think about those because that's all you have, are those interactions and those moments. So the more of those happy, wonderful times you can make for not only yourself but for others, the better the world's going to be.
So one thing that I'm really interested to hear about, have you gotten any pushback from people in the atheist community? Because I know there are lots of dictionary atheists who think that it's strictly just supposed to be an intellectual exercise and, philosophy and all of that kind of stuff. Do you get pushback from those people or criticism or anything like that?
I don't get too much criticism, but the one thing I do get is that it's an extremely difficult film and book to market and publicize. And I think because the atheist community in particular, we like the controversy. We like the fights. We like, which is kind of, I shouldn't say just for our community. I think it's a natural human thing.
Yeah.
People love to fight. It's like a sport, right?
Yeah.
And so people love the debates and people love the kind of fighting religion mentality, which, like I said, is an important component of it. But I do find it difficult to market something that is a positive message.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Well, because so many of us get into atheist activism because we're pissed off at what religion is doing and about what religious people do. And so when we get into those spaces where it's safe to do that, I think sometimes the impetus is to jump strictly to talking about how much you dislike religion or anything like that. So yeah, I think that is kind of a natural thing.
And I think one thing that's interesting about, you mentioned kind of dictionary atheists who think it's just an intellectual exercise. I think that's really interesting because that seems very detached from the reality of even religious people. I've said this before, that I don't think anybody hears the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God and believes in God because of it. So nobody's believing in God because of these arguments. People believe in God for emotional reasons. People believe in God because of indoctrination. People believe in God because they don't want to die. They don't want their friends to die. They want to live forever. These issues with mortality, all these things. So if we treat it on our side as simply an intellectual exercise, I don't think we're even addressing the reasons why people believe in God in the first place. So if we talk about these issues of life and death and meaning and morality and purpose, I think we're really getting at the core as to why people are religious in the first place. And I would also add community to that as well. Community is a huge part of it. So many people go to church because they want to spend time every week with a group of people doing something that is meaningful to them. And what I love is that I'm meeting groups all over the country that are doing just that, but in a secular way.
Yeah, we do tend to kind of talk over each other in these fights sometimes, to where when we're having a discussion with a religious person and we're throwing strictly intellect at them and they're throwing emotion back at us, regardless of what we think about those things. I mean, I'm a big proponent of meeting people where they are. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I think so little time is spent trying to understand the person's position before you try to undermine it. And try to, because some people do feel that they have super intellectual reasons for believing in God. Some people will straight out admit that it's a totally emotional thing. And you can't have the same conversation with those two people.
Right, exactly.
So tell me a little bit about your story and what led you to this point, to wanting to be a filmmaker, to doing this and the atheist community and that whole thing.
Well, I grew up in Seattle, which is a very liberal place. Nobody really cares if you're religious or not there. And I grew up in a very secular household. My father is a very liberal Christian. He didn't start going to church until I was in college, I think. So we were raised in a very secular environment. My mother's an atheist, and it was, we knew the stories of Jesus, for Christmas and that kind of thing, but it was never taught as, this is true, this is really what happened. It was more of a, a fairy tale type thing. So I was raised pretty much without any kind of religious indoctrination. But I always found the topic kind of interesting, just I guess because I never had it myself. So when I got to college, I ended up minoring in religious studies, just because I found it interesting what other people believed. Really? They're Scientologists believe that? That's really weird. Right. Mormons believe that? Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. And actually, the more I studied religion in college, the more of an atheist I became. Well, I'd always been an atheist, but the more adopting of the atheist label. Because I think up to that point, I didn't really see a need to even call myself an atheist.
Because to you it was just the thing.
I was just a nun, basically, at that point. And so I went to school in Montreal, in Quebec, and then moved to New York 8 years ago. And so I've been very lucky to live in 3 extremely liberal, non-religious cities in my life. So I don't really have the same experience as many people who are in the atheist community because they grew up religious and then are kind of turning away from that.
Very cool. So, and obviously to the subject of the show, being, the intersection of LGBT and atheist activism, has being gay factored into any of this? I mean, if you grew up in a super liberal environment, maybe not, but...
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because I think the intersection of those two things is an interesting dynamic. And many of the people that I spoke to for the book, who are also part of the LGBT community, we'd always talk about the similarities and differences between coming out as an atheist and coming out as being gay or lesbian or trans or something like that, and both the similarities and the differences. And I think that's really interesting. For me, being gay, it was a very similar thing to being an atheist, where I think because I never had that religious indoctrination, that religious upbringing, that there was never anything wrong with being gay, never. And in fact,
which is how it should be,
right? Well, I mean, it's funny that I have to say that as this is a weird concept,
right?
But I'm very lucky in that way that I never had a moment of, oh my God, I'm gay. This is what am I going to do? How am I going to, I really never did. And in fact, I remember a moment where I just kind of thought to myself, I guess I'm gay. All right, well, what's for dinner?
Right, yeah.
It was never an issue. And that's one of the things that I really, that bothers me a lot about the religious culture in America in particular, well, the world as well, but particularly the one that I see in the United States, is the obsession with sexuality, controlling sexuality, having a huge issue with whether or not somebody is gay or straight or bi or trans or whatever. The fact that people care so much about what other people do that doesn't affect them at all, it just boggles my mind. And maybe that's because, I never grew up religious or anything like that, but it just seems so weird to me that people spend so much time and money fighting like marriage equality, for example. The fact that we had to, drag the country kicking and screaming into saying, yeah, we need marriage equality, it amazes me that we even have to have that conversation.
Right. So what's next? I mean, I know you're in the middle of, screening the film, like basically all over the world and the galaxy and universe and everything.
Right next door.
Right next door, in fact. Have you given any thought to any sort of future project thing that you're thinking about doing or trying to do or anything?
That's a good question. I don't actually know yet. I'm touring with the film until the spring. So I'm doing a whole Northern European tour. I'm doing a screening in Guatemala in February. I'm doing all across the United States, even more. All kinds of screenings in really incredible places. And then that'll come to an end in the spring, and I don't know what I'm going to do. So I'm spoiled in a way because I've loved doing this project, both the book and the film, so much that I've set the bar pretty high. So whatever I do next, I hope it's something I'm as passionate about, because this has really been quite the experience.
Cool. So where can people go to buy the book or the movie?
They can go to my website, which is theatheistbook.com, where you can get the film as a download, you can stream it, you can buy a DVD, and the book is available there, and the book is also available on Amazon.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I appreciate you taking the time out of your super busy schedule.
Thank you so much.
We'll have the audio of my talk from the Glisten Youth Summit coming up next on the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello, I'm Alan Cumming. Live Out Loud is calling on the LGBT community to help improve life for gay teens. Take what you know and gay it forward through the Homecoming Project, a chance to return to your old high school and share your story with LGBTQ youth. Your life experiences and wisdom can prove invaluable to teens who may be struggling with their own identities and paths in life. One day can make a lasting difference. Gay it forward with the Homecoming Project. Find us at liveoutloud.info to learn how you can get involved today.
Here's an excerpt from Our Constitution, The Way It Was by Dr. Madeleine O'Hare.
Seemingly, no one knew just what to do. There was no clear-cut program. Some wanted to try to continue to negotiate with the British government. Others wanted to continue the armed revolt in the hopes of forcing the king and parliament to remedy their grievances. There was no one, apparently, who had the vision to call for complete severance of all political ties with Britain and to found a new nation. The situation remained stalemated until the end of the year. Then, in January 1775, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, came off the press. It was like a fresh wind clearing away a fog. In the simple yet forceful language that characterizes all his writings, Paine showed the absurdity of continuing a relationship of colonies to a mother country. Why, he asked, should the colonies, already peopled with 3 million inhabitants and destined to expand to cover a vast continent, be ruled from a small island 3,000 miles away? Why continue to be subjects of a tyrant king when the way was open to be citizens of a free republic? This pamphlet spread like wildfire. The small presses of the time could not keep up with the demand. Hundreds of thousands of copies were issued and penetrated to every colony in a short time. Paine's arguments were unanswerable. They left no middle ground. All talk of compromise and further petitions to Parliament died out. The debate was carried into the Continental Congress, and in a couple of months, a committee was appointed to draw up a formal statement. Thomas Jefferson was selected by the committee to make the draft. 6 months, almost to the day, after Paine's Common Sense appeared, Congress issued that famous document, which we call the Declaration of Independence. It has often been claimed that Paine actually composed and wrote the Declaration. This is debatable, and there seems to be no strong evidence to that effect, but that he was the man, more so than any other, who caused it to be written, no one can deny. All of the leaders of the Revolution gave him full credit for solidifying the sentiment for independence. Washington, converted by common sense, wrote asserting that Paine's words were, quote, sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning. Jefferson, John Adams, Franklin, and Madison all wrote praising Paine's flaming arguments. In later years, Thomas Jefferson said of Paine, quote, no writer has exceeded Paine in ease and familiarity of style, perspicuity of expression, happiness of elucidation, and in simple and unassuming language, end quote. Franklin said, I value myself on the share I had in procuring for America the acquisition of so useful and valuable a citizen as Thomas Paine. John Adams wrote, history will ascribe the Revolution to Thomas Paine.
Our Constitution, The Way It Was by Dr. Madeline O'Hare, is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
And welcome back once again to the Gaytheist Manifesto. This past weekend on Saturday, October 24th, I gave my first ever talk about atheism at an LGBT event. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not really, wasn't really sure what to expect. I thought maybe there might be some in the audience who are hostile to what I had to say, maybe some people who are curious, but I actually found an overwhelmingly supportive audience, which I think was awesome. There were maybe 40 people in the room out of the whole summit, which was cool. And so without further ado, here's my talk from the GLSEN Youth Summit. My name is Callie Wright. I'm a trans woman. I am bisexual. I host a podcast called the Gaytheist Manifesto. I'm a sci-fi nerd. I am an expert ice cream eater. And more relevant to this presentation, I am an atheist. So, what is atheism? I'm here to talk about what atheism is as a worldview, but also as a culture and as a movement, and one that I think is well positioned to lead the fight for LGBT equality as we move into the future. And this quote here from Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of describes at its heart why I'm an atheist. He says, the more I learn about the universe, the more convinced I am that there isn't any sort of benevolent force that has anything to do with it at all. So what exactly is atheism? A good starting point for a definition is a disbelief or lack of belief in God or gods. Now, if there's anyone else here who enjoys philosophy like I do, you know that there's a ton more to unpack, but this is a good place to start, and we don't have 3 days to have that full-on conversation. So before we jump into defining what atheism is, I think it makes a little more sense to talk for a minute about what atheism isn't, because I find that's where a lot of misunderstandings end up. And some of these may make you laugh, some of them may annoy you, some of these you may even agree with, depending on your worldview. But just know that everything I'm going to talk about here is something that I have had lobbed at me over the years by people who disagree with my position. And I've picked out the ones that, in my experience, seem to be the most common. Atheism is not Satanism. And of course this should go without saying, but there you go. And anyone who thinks that this is a silly thing has obviously not engaged in very many online conversations with people about these issues. And of course this is silly because if we don't believe in God, we don't have much of a reason to believe in his arch nemesis either. Where this actually comes from, in all seriousness, is that lots of more fundamentalist religious people actually believe that atheists are being deceived by Satan, and that therefore we're in service to Satan by practicing atheism. But I also have been told before that atheism is a cover for open worship of Satan.
Cover Satanists, it wouldn't just be open Satanists.
Right.
There's a statue. There's no reason
Right.
to be what teaches.
Atheism is not anti-theism. Some atheists... Yeah.
I was going to say, if you're Christopher Hitchens, you can claim that title if you'd like.
Fair enough. Well, right. So, let me finish. Thanks. Some atheists are anti-theists and some aren't. An anti-theist, for those who don't know, is somebody who goes beyond saying that religion is wrong to thinking that religion is actually bad and harmful and is something to be actively opposed and fought against. And some atheists fit this definition, some don't, and like most things in life, it's best not to assume. Atheism is not monolithic. Of course, by the dictionary definition, atheism just means one specific thing about a thing you don't believe in. But, as atheists, we do have a community, and the atheist community is as diverse as any other. There are people who are concerned with strictly intellectual pursuits. There are people who are concerned with things like social justice, sex positivity, separation of church and state, and many other issues of the day, many of which aren't even mutually exclusive with what some faith communities do. And we don't all have the same political beliefs. We don't all have the same taste in music, movies, or literature. We are people of all genders and sexualities. We're racially and cultural diverse. And in short, there's no typical atheist, just like there's no typical trans person or typical gay person. Atheism is not dogmatic. Atheism, speaking strictly, is a philosophical position on the existence or non-existence of a deity. There are no prescriptive rules other than fitting the definition of having no belief in a God. Now, for sure, a community has grown up around these issues, and you can see trends like people in the atheist community do tend to be more politically liberal, but atheism isn't necessarily prescriptive of those things. There are no creeds or dogmas, there's no holy texts, no mandates about who you are or how to behave. That's why we have humanism, which is a thing that I'll get into a little bit later. Atheism is not void of joy or meaning. Holy crap. There seems to be an There seems to be an idea among a lot of people that you can't have a joyful or a meaningful life if you don't have a God to look up to or an afterlife to look forward to. And I can simply submit my life and the lives of many of my fellow atheists as refutation to this idea. Indeed, for many of us, the idea of our lives being finite is precisely what gives them meaning. Our lives for us have the meaning and purpose that we choose to attach to them. Atheism is not an act of rebellion. Many religious folks see atheists as being in open rebellion against God because we're angry or we don't want to be held accountable for our actions or name a million other reasons. And of course, this is as wrong as accusing us of being Satanists because it's of course difficult to be in rebellion against an entity you don't acknowledge the existence of, right? So, now that we haven't covered what atheism is...
They found us out!
I think it's useful to also talk about certain atheist stereotypes and some of the things that we see surrounding atheists and how we act and how we think. And like any other group of people with a stigma surrounding them, there are lots of stereotypes about atheists ranging from ridiculous stuff like this and to things like how angry we are and how militant we are and how hateful we can be. So I think one of the most pervasive atheist stereotypes is how angry we are. And to be honest, this one's not really undeserved. Many of us are very, very angry for lots of different reasons. Many atheists, when we figure out that whatever religion we grow up with doesn't make sense to us anymore, we feel like we've been lied to our entire lives. About things like hell and sin, about things that come naturally to people like sex, and we repress ourselves for those reasons. And when we figure out that those beliefs don't make sense anymore, there's a deep sense of anger that can develop over the wasted time we spent agonizing over things that we never should have had to agonize over in the first place. And what makes this worse in most cases is that we feel like the people who have done the lying aren't people who are intentionally being deceptive. They're just people who use the best of their knowledge and their worldview to pass their views down to us, and they weren't being deceptive or malicious. So there's nowhere to point the finger at when you're saying, oh, this really makes me mad. Who am I mad at? I don't know. And so that feeling can get pretty intense, especially for people who've come out of seriously oppressive religious environments. Another thing that we get angry about is what we see the harm that religion can cause. And I'm not necessarily here to debate or convince or make a case or anything like that, but this is a position that many or most atheists hold. And we can point to lots of examples of this, the most relevant to this event being obviously the fundamentalist religious opposition to LGBT equality. And we can spend lots of time debating whether they do that rightly or wrongly in the context of their own religion, but the people who fight the loudest and hardest are most certainly using religion to justify their position. And that's another reason why we get angry. Something else that makes atheists angry, and this one is a particular sticking point for me, is the assumption that as atheists we can't have moral compass. One of the first questions that I'm often asked when people find out I'm an atheist is where I get my morals from. And I've also had it outright asserted to me that I can't possibly have a moral compass because I don't believe in God. I was even told once by someone that I was the least atheist person they ever met because of the activism that I do and because I like giving hugs. And so, yeah, do the math on that one. So I could spend hours talking about where I get my moral compass from, but trust me when I say I do have one. Another thing that often makes us angry is that we are a marginalized group. We're often excluded from public and private spaces, often specifically because of our lack of belief. People erect monuments to fallen veterans with all kinds of religious iconography, and the people who are secular humanists or atheists who gave their lives for the country are often completely forgotten or left out of the conversation. City council meetings and government functions are very often opened with prayers, and when a secular humanist organization says, hey, we'd like to participate, often they're told, no, sorry, you don't believe in God, so you can't open the meeting. There are many schools that have religious clubs but can't form secular student alliances, and gay straight alliances too. When we try to speak up for ourselves and our right to see ourselves represented in public spaces, we're often told simply that we should just move elsewhere, where there are people who think and believe more like we do. There was even a study that asked about people's level of trust for certain groups, and atheists scored, it was rapists, atheists.
What?
Yeah. It was in 2011, so I don't know if that's changed, but that study did happen.
In there somewhere.
Yeah. And outside of the U.S., it's even worse. There are 13 countries around the world where it's legal. Being convicted of atheism is a death penalty offense.
What the hell?
And many more where you can be thrown in prison or you can be murdered and the cops just don't care.
Don't go to Saudi Arabia.
Or Bangladesh, apparently. 5 atheist bloggers have been murdered this year in Bangladesh, as in, hacked to death with machetes on the street. Just because they spoke out against religion. Another thing that makes us angry is the assumption that our beliefs don't stem from a rational thought process. I've lost track of how many times my atheism has been dismissed as simply the result of me being hurt by religion or by religious people in some way. By people who have never actually bothered to ask me why I'm atheist, or anything about my story, or why I used to be Christian and I'm not anymore. I'm not going to pretend that all atheists are perfectly rational people who've thought all these questions thoroughly through to come to a strictly logical conclusion about their worldview, but to paint the atheist worldview as simply an emotional reaction to religion is really dismissive and disrespectful. So for these reasons and others, atheists are, in fact, often quite angry. So remember this part when you speak out for LGBT equality and how angry you are at the way that you get treated by society, the way that we're purposely excluded from situations both in public and private, and think of how many times you've been accused of overreacting and being too angry. Now, of course, the way that atheists are discriminated against, at least in this country, is nowhere near the level of persecution that queer or trans people face. But atheists are still a group of people who are largely excluded from the broader societal conversation. And just like we in the LGBT community get angry about being treated unfairly, atheists do too. And I touched on this one earlier, but I think it's worth unpacking a little more. I think atheism might be the only worldview that's socially acceptable to dismiss offhand as being an emotional reaction. People like to come up with any reason other than a rational discussion and examination of the facts as a reason for a person's rejection of religion. And we talked a lot about anger, so I'm not going to dive super deep into this, but oftentimes atheists are told that we reject God just because we're mad at God for not giving us something we wanted, for the death of a loved one, for some injustice in the world. And I will say, for the sake of clarity, that those things sometimes are the impetus for someone beginning to question their belief. But at the end of the day, as I said before, you can't be angry at an entity you don't believe exists. I've been told several times before that the reason I don't believe is because I didn't find a church that does Christianity the right way. If I would just come to their church, I would see what the real deal was. Now, I can't speak for every atheist out there, but I don't remember having really bad experiences at church. I heard a lot of things preached from the pulpit that I didn't necessarily disagree with, and the idea of hell scared the crap out of me as a kid. But for the most part, I felt pretty welcome and comfortable at church. And just like the you're angry at God thing, a bad experience at church or multiple churches can be the impetus for someone beginning to question their belief. But I've never once met an atheist or heard from an atheist who rejected God simply because something bad happened at church. Many of us are often told that we would just see the truth of God's existence if we would only give him the chance. And this, of course, stems from the very presumptuous assumption that none of us have actually given God a chance. I will say almost all of the prominent members of the atheist movement were once devout Christians themselves. Many were preachers, pastors, preachers, pastors, radio hosts, so on and so forth. I've interviewed people for my podcast who struggled with horrifying depression because they wanted so badly for God to be real. They reached out to him in desperation, praying, crying on their knees every night to get no response back. And I think it's super presumptuous to assume that those folks didn't actually give God a chance. Another one that I've been told plenty of times is that I'm pretending God doesn't exist because I want to justify continuing in whatever sinful lifestyle I lead, whether that's being queer, whether that's being trans, blaspheming against God, having sex outside of marriage, living with my partner outside of marriage, sleeping late on Sunday morning, and on and on and on. And of course, this one doesn't make a lot of sense because I don't acknowledge the concept of sin, nor the authority of the deity who laid down what a sin is and isn't in the first place. And this one sort of ties back into the atheism and morality question. It's often posited that we're atheists because we don't want to acknowledge the ultimate and eternal consequences for our actions. Therefore, we deny the existence of God to escape the consequences of our actions. And without getting too preachy here, I will say the fact that I think this life is the only one that I have keeps me very cognizant of the consequences of my actions. I don't get a second shot, and I can't absolve myself of any wrong I've done just by asking for forgiveness. So the point here is that there are as many paths to atheism as there are people who are atheist. Everyone's journey, experiences, and reasons are different. I'm trying to make that guy go away. Whatever. Not making assumptions about people is always a good idea, but in this case, I think it especially applies. Another great great stereotype about atheists is that we hate religious people, or that we think religious people are stupid. And I'm just going to come right out and say that there are lots of atheists who do. I am not one of them, and I argue with these people a lot, because I think they're wrong. I definitely don't claim that all atheists are good people, or that we're all understanding and multicultural and open-minded. There are some what I like to call dictionary atheists, who refuse to let atheism be about anything other than an intellectual exercise and how much smarter they are than everyone else. Those people do exist, not trying to push it under the rug, but they annoy the crap out of me. I fight with them often, but there it is. But the reality is most of us don't hate anybody, nor do we think that as a rule religious people are stupid. The fact is there are many incredibly intelligent and sophisticated theists of all kinds. We have a fundamental disagreement about the supernatural, and often that disagreement leads logically to others, but there's no need for hostility simply because of those differences. Most of us really do want to live and let live. I'm interested in having the conversation about religion with anyone who's interested in having it with me, and I will go to the mat for the conclusions that I've come to about God, religion, spirituality, and the supernatural. But it's also not a big deal to me if people disagree with me. Providing, of course, those disagreements don't lead to people trying to impose their worldview through legislation. That's a whole different story. That's why you see most atheist activism surrounds issues of separation of church and state. We're not trying to take anyone's religious freedom away from them. We're just trying to fight for our own freedom from religion. Another stereotype that's super common, or at least people I argue with regularly, is that we can't have any morals. Talked about this one earlier, but we're going to unpack it a little bit more. Or that we just make up whatever values that we have because it feels good to us. And speaking of anger, if you want to get me going, this is the one to quote. The fact is that most people, religious or not, have a moral code that looks pretty similar. And it usually boils down to the idea that I'd like to be able to do whatever I want with my life, so long as me doing that doesn't interfere with your right to do the same. That's obviously really, really simplistic, but I would argue that's the jumping off point for the morality of almost everyone, regardless of their religious affiliation or lack thereof. My moral code starts with empathy. I understand that my actions have consequences, and that those consequences can cause harm to others. I don't want others to act in a way that's harmful to me, so I avoid acting in a way that's harmful to others, and indeed I try to act in a way that's beneficial to others. That's why charity is important to me, and that's why activism is important to me. What many who claim that morality can only come from a divine source don't realize is that we are not the only creatures on the planet who display moral behavior. Many of our great ape cousins do as well. So these things aren't unique to humanity, and it seems built into us as a social species by our evolutionary history. One of the advantages of not believing in a supreme divine authority is that we are free to constantly reevaluate and retool our moral thinking as we learn more about the world and the human experience so we can be better and do better. And the last among the stereotypes that I'm going to talk about here is that atheists must live a joyless and meaningless life. And there are a few reasons that this is asserted. Most of them surround the idea that atheists have to be nihilists. And this may come off as harsh, but my first response is usually that the universe doesn't owe you or anyone else a sense of meaning. Sorry. I don't believe that there's a greater cosmic meaning to anything, but that doesn't make my life completely devoid of meaning. Because after all, the question of whether or not a God exists, of course, at its core is simply a question of, here's an assertion, is it true or is it untrue? Atheism could be the most soul-crushing and destroying and depressing worldview there is, that wouldn't necessarily make it untrue. I don't personally think it's a soul-crushing or depressing worldview, but that really has no bearing on whether or not it's a true position. That being said, I think being an atheist is incredibly freeing, because at that point my life can mean what I choose for it to mean. I have no authority telling me what I can and can't be, what I should or shouldn't believe, or what my life should or shouldn't be about. Humans are social creatures, and congregating in communities brings many of us a deep sense of meaning and purpose. The atheist community has done this for me. It fills me up to be around people who are passionate about the same things I am and who want to see the same changes in the world that I do. I wish I had video of some of the get-togethers that happen after atheist conventions. Maybe some people don't wish that I had that video. But the reason I say this, the last convention that I was at, literally the last thing that I did, we closed down a hotel bar, and there were 8 of us standing around the bar, including the bartender, because he loved us, singing a song together, laughing, crying, hugging each other, because we're a family. And that's where I get my meaning from, and I take so much joy from that. So philosophical disagreements aside, in practical terms, atheism simply means living your life as if there was no God, no afterlife, and no supernatural. And obviously there are lots of really spirited disagreements among people surrounding things like the burden of proof, whether you can prove a negative, what degree of certainty you can have about a negative, whether or not atheism and social justice should mix, and stuff like that. And trust me, I love philosophy too, but again, I don't have a week. So I also think it's important in any talk about atheism to also talk about humanism, because atheism and the various ways that we define it describes a particular thing that we don't believe in. And for many or most of us, that's not enough. We need a moral and ethical philosophy to guide our decision-making and the way that we live our lives. And for many of us, that philosophy is humanism. The quote here is from Jean-Paul Sartre. Thank you. There it is. You all know, and I don't. That's okay. He said, life has no meaning a priori. It is up to you to give it a meaning, and value is nothing but the meaning that you choose. And for me as an atheist, that meaning and value comes from humanism. So to define humanism real quick, it's an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Humanist beliefs stress the potential, value, and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. And now that we've kind of worked on what atheism is and isn't, I'm going to spend a minute talking about the atheist community and the kinds of things that go on in the community. So conventions and conferences are kind of the apex, I guess, of atheist community activity. These are the logos for the 3 conferences that I've attended in my short time being active in the atheist movement. The one at the top, the Carolina Secular Convention, actually had me as a featured speaker earlier this month. It was ReasonCon, which was my first conference ever, and then the Pennsylvania State Atheist Humanist Convention. The thing that's notable about that one is the last day of the convention, all of the attendees packaged 30,000 meals to give to the Central Pennsylvania Food Bank. So we don't just sit around and yell about how much we hate God. There are local atheist meetup groups. These are 2 in the Cincinnati area, the Free Inquiry Group and the Tri-State Free Thinkers. You'll find local atheist and free thought groups doing all kinds of community activities. And not all of it's atheism related. Sometimes it's service projects, cleaning up a neighborhood, volunteering at food kitchens and homeless shelters, going to protests to support Planned Parenthood, and Tri-State Free Thinkers is even sponsoring this year's Transgender Day of Remembrance. There are also quite a few organizations that have cropped up to serve various needs in the atheist community. I see your Camp Quest shirt. Yeah, there it is. A few of my favorites to go over real quick. Recovering from Religion is a group that provides support to people who are transitioning from living as a person of faith to living as a person without religious beliefs. They provide support in the form of actual meetup and support groups. They have a hotline project where people can call in to voice their doubts, and to talk to someone who knows what they're going through. There's Camp Quest, which is a secular summer camp for kids 8 to 17. There's the Camp Quest shirt, so if you have more questions. Yeah. There's Secular Coalition for America, which is actually an atheist lobbying group. So they're in Washington, D.C., actually lobbying Congress on issues of separation of church and state. And Foundation Beyond Belief might be my favorite of all of these. Basically, Foundation Beyond Belief is kind of a charity aggregator. You become a member, you give them $10 a month, and they donate it to secular charities of your choice, basically. And it's also worth noting that this month, one of Foundation Beyond Belief's beneficiaries is the Transgender Law Center. So where do I, personally, fit into all of this? The focus of most of my activism surrounds my podcast. I do a podcast called the Gaytheist Manifesto, and the topic of the show is basically the intersectionality between atheist and LGBT activism. So my goal as an activist is to do outreach to the LGBT community on behalf of the atheist community and vice versa. I think we as communities have far more in common than we generally realize we do, and that our movements would do well to partner with each other more often. So the next logical question is why? Why atheism and LGBT? What do these movements share? And the answer is more than you might think. So here's a quick thought exercise. A question for the folks in the room who are queer or trans identified. I'm not going to ask anyone to out themselves by raising your hands, but just think to yourself, if you do happen to be a queer or trans identified person, assuming you have come out, did you come out immediately upon the onset of you questioning your identity? Did you come out when you realized for sure that you were gay or that you were bi or that you were pansexual or asexual or transgender or any number of identities on that spectrum? Of course you didn't. Most people don't. I don't want to generalize. But why didn't you? Why didn't you think that this was a thing you could just come right out and share with the folks around you? The answer in whole or part is identity. Most of us grow up with the notion that the default person equals heterosexual and cisgender. Therefore, when we start to have an inkling that we may not be one or either of those things, instead of just simply recognizing that we are just a different kind of person, it's very easy to come to the conclusion that there is actually something very wrong with us. Even in some more liberal environments, though we may be free to explore many different facets of our identity, the idea of being straight and cis is simply handed down to us by the behavior and assumptions of our families, our communities, the media, and society at large. So the point here is that coming out as any flavor of queer or trans is basically shouting out to the world that you aren't actually the default thing they think you are. And you then have to figure out entirely new ways of navigating the world. Even if you have a supportive group of friends, family, and community, society at large is still a very hostile place to be a queer or trans person. And we now have to unlearn the ways that we've learned to navigate the world in order to learn new ones that reflect our newly realized or newly actualized identities. So I'm guessing that many or most people in the room probably understood that whole last bit before I explained it here. So the next step is to answer the question of why is that relevant and a discussion about the atheist worldview. And it's a question I'm glad you asked. Maybe you'd be surprised to find, maybe you wouldn't, but someone who's beginning to doubt their faith or someone in a fundamentalist religious environment who's lost their faith completely, those folks often have a very similar, if not the same kind of identity struggles that queer or trans folks do when we're wrestling with figuring out who we are and how we fit into the world. For many folks, leaving their religion behind entails a radical paradigm shift in their identity. And they're trading in everything that they've known about their world and their lives for something that many or most people don't understand and that some people are outright hostile and hateful towards. So to illustrate this point, let's play a game. Woo! So I'm going to show you several quotes that I found on the internet that deal with struggling with religious, gender, or sexual identity, with some of the identifying words taken out, and I want to see if you can tell the difference. It makes you feel inferior, like you're not quite human. I kept it to myself for a long time because I was afraid to talk to other people about it. I've been so careful about hiding stuff from my dad, but he saw my today. He preached at me for hours, and I've had panic attacks ever since. I knew if I came out, I would lose my job. I pretend to be just to be accepted by my best friends. I pretend to be at work because my boss is really conservative. My dad told me my sister got cancer because I'm... Really? I don't know what to do. I think my husband knows. He'll make me leave if he finds out. I can't lose my kids, but I don't know how long I can keep this up. It's creepy, isn't it? Now, something to keep in mind here is that my purpose is not to draw a direct parallel between the struggles of someone leaving their faith and the struggles of someone living as a queer or especially as a trans person in society. There's no epidemic of atheists being murdered, at least not in this country, and it's generally not legal to fire someone from their job for being an atheist. And as much as atheists get crapped on by people in the public square, if we take it to court, we usually win. But as I've illustrated before, the internal struggle with your identity and your place in the world often looks very much the same from both angles. And in some cases, the consequences from both society and your social circles can be very similar. And so the next question I want to answer here is, what exactly does the atheist movement bring to the table for LGBT equality? I recognize, acknowledge, and appreciate the many, many faith communities who are as deeply invested in this fight as I am and who have been doing it since long before I was born. My purpose is not to dismiss or downplay any of that. But I do think the atheist movement has something unique to offer the LGBT movement, and that we have important contributions to make. So the first is generally open minds. Of course, anyone who's involved at all in the atheist community knows that there are plenty of closed-minded jerks, just like anywhere else. But the thing about most atheists is that we weren't always atheists. Almost everyone still grows up being taught a religious worldview from birth of some kind. And the fact that atheists have changed their mind on that super important issue, I think, generally leads to them being more open-minded on other things. And of course, that doesn't hold up. I mean, you can find many exceptions to that. But generally speaking, I've found that to be the case in the community. Since we don't acknowledge any higher power or authority, we are free to make our decisions simply by reviewing the evidence at hand and searching our conscience. There's no holy text to consider, no contradictory messages about how we should view or treat others from either a religious book or from a religious institution. Almost anyone who is atheist, openly, understands at least to some degree what it's like to have people make judgments about you based on a single aspect of your personality, and to live in a society that generally doesn't think very highly of you, and in some cases is outright hostile. So I think many, if not most, atheists are a little better positioned to have a sense of empathy when it comes to trying to understand the struggles of queer or trans people. And the last thing is that atheist activism usually actually means secular activism. Generally speaking, you don't see atheist activists out there trying to strip people away from their religion. What you find is that most activism in the atheist community surrounds issues of separation of church and state. And given that all of the most vehement and passionate opposition to LGBT equality comes from the religious right, it's my assertion that secular activism is LGBT activism by proxy. Because in a world where religion doesn't get to make the rules, queer and trans people are objectively better off. So, as I come to the end here, I hope you've learned a lot from the talk. The atheist community is as diverse and vibrant as any other, and is overwhelmingly welcoming, in my experience, to LGBT folks. Many of us atheists are passionate about the same things that everyone in the LGBT community are. We want to make the world a better place just like anyone else does. We want to live in a world where it's taken for granted that your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your religious beliefs, etc. have no bearing on the way that you're treated in society. In my short time being involved in the atheist community, I've gotten acquainted with and even become pretty good friends with some of the more prominent folks in the movement. And to a person, they are all passionate about LGBT equality. And even when I'm the only trans person in the room, I've never felt tokenized, taken advantage of, gawked at, looked down upon, or treated as the other. To my friends and family in the atheist community, I and every person in this room are just people. People with differing and unique life experiences, for sure. People who experience unique brands of oppression and marginalization, for sure. But simply people nonetheless. When I reached out the first time to have a conversation with someone in the atheist community about trans issues, I didn't really know what to expect. I was invited to record an interview for the show the next day. And in the 8 months since, I've been a guest on at least 15 podcasts, some of which are shows that are downloaded by tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people a month. My own show has grown to average between 700 and 800 downloads a week. I've been invited to speak at several conferences about these issues, and I've had countless amazing conversations with people on an individual level about the issues that trans folks and queer folks face, and how the atheist community can be better allies. The atheist community, in my experience, is super, super hungry for this conversation, and the response that I've gotten has been nothing short of incredible. We have lots and lots of staunch, passionate allies in the atheist community, and I hope that after this talk, you will decide to get to know us a little better. Thank you. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I again want to thank my guests Chris Johnson and Adam Collins for the awesome stuff that they're doing. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can find me on Twitter at GaytheistCali. You can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheist, and you can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.